Hi, Ed here from Crystal Clear Aquatics. Despite appearances, it's actually spring here in the UK. Tomorrow's the 1st of April. Last week it was 20 degrees, beautiful sunshine and warm, and today, a week later, it's 2 degrees and trying to snow. This is fairly typical for UK weather. Now during the spring, there's a few chores that you want to do to your pond. At this time of year I carry out my spring servicing, which entails cleaning out filtration systems, vacuuming ponds and other various pond-related jobs. So this is a good opportunity for me to give you 5 top chores that you should do to your pond this spring. So job number 1 is clean your filtration system out if you have one. It's really important at this time of year as the water temperatures in the pond start to raise and increase and the daylight hours increase, that you keep your filtration system running at peak performance. There's probably not much that's happened during the winter months and you may well have neglected your filter through the winter. It's a bit too cold and nobody wants to come outside and get mucky. So now's a really good opportunity to make sure that you clean your filter media and replace it if required. In this particular system, this is an Aquatics Screen-O-Matic, and the bulk of the filtration is just a series of open cellular foams. So I'm going to go around and give these a good clean, inspect them. If they look damaged, then think about replacing them, although I know in this particular set that won't be required. So give your filter a spring clean. Now if you find that you do have to replace your filter media, it's always worthwhile either changing half of the media, leaving it for 4 or 5 weeks for the new media to establish and build up beneficial bacteria, and then you can replace the second half. Or if you're replacing filter media on a very established pond and you end up having to replace all of the foams in one go, just make sure that you add some sort of biological additive, a biological activator to kickstart the filter and to replenish all that beneficial nitrifying bacteria that you've lost. Now in this particular case, I'm not going to replace any of the media, and all of the foams are being washed in pond water. That's important. Again, if you wash filter media out in tap water and you're too aggressive with cleaning, you'll end up blasting away lots and lots of the good stuff that you want to hang on to. So just a light wash is all that's required, preferably in pond water. Now as part of your filter clean or filter service, if you've got a UVC, it's also really important to make sure you replace the UV tubes during the spring months. Here in the UK, sort of March, April, early May, that's about the time you want to think about doing it. And that's to ensure that, again, your filtration system is running in peak performance, but more importantly, the UV is the clarifier. It's this which is controlling green water and helping to keep the pond nice and clear. Now, you may find that your UV tube is still working after a season's use, and despite it igniting, firing up, looking blue, it's still important that you replace it, because the amount of UV radiation that's emitted from a tube that's had a season's use drops dramatically. So as the pond starts to warm and daylight hours increase, ponds will typically go through what we call in the trade a spring algae bloom. And you'll either get lots of blanket weed or lots of green water. Now UV clarifiers are not really going to control blanket weed, but what they are designed to control is to kill off that single cellular algae that will create green water, a pea super. So make sure you replace your UV tubes. I always like to hang on to the old tubes as kind of a temporary spare. If a new bulb were to blow prematurely later on in the season, sort of September, October time, rather than having to replace with brand new tubes, you could just whip in your old ones just to keep you going through the autumn and winter months. It's also very important to make sure that your quartz sleeve is nice and clean. It's pointless replacing the tubes if your quartz sleeve is dirty and is restricting the light getting to the water in the first place. You might find that you have to give it a bit of a scrub with something abrasive, like a bit of wire wool or a Brillo pad, but just make sure that you get rid of all those limescale deposits and algae and keep it clean. Now if you've got a system a bit like this, a Aquatics, where you have to remove the quartz sleeve to be able to access the tubes, during the spring months when it's still quite cold, it can be quite tricky to remove this. And these are very fragile and quite expensive quartz glass, and if you break it or damage it, you're at risk of compromising and damaging the ballast and the electrics of the UV, which is an expensive component, and you won't be able to run it. So you've got to be very careful when you remove this. One little tip is, if you struggle to remove it and you don't want to be too forceful, just use a heat gun and warm gently the plastics around the quartz sleeve, particularly focusing on that rubber seal. And once that softens up, you'll find that this is a lot easier to remove. And on cold days like this, it's quite nice to have a heat gun to hand. I should have called this video 5 things you should do during your winter service, because it's not very spring-like today. We've actually got snow laying on the ground now. Never mind, give it half an hour, the sun will be out and I'll probably be in my t-shirt. So job number 2 to do to your pond this spring is to vacuum the pond. And if you haven't got a pond vacuum to hand, to use a net to dredge out some of the debris and the leaf litter and muck that accumulates in the bottom of the pond during the winter months. Now, it's worth noting that a certain amount of this biological matter on the bottom of the pond is actually really beneficial to wildlife. So if you've got a natural pond or a wildlife pond, you don't want to be too clean here. Just a few scoopfuls with a net or half an hour or so with a pond vacuum just to get rid of some of the accumulation is all that's required. If you've got a koi pond or a fish pond and the ultimate aim is to keep your pond as clean and clear as possible, of course you want to do a slightly more comprehensive clean and try and get rid of as much of that as possible. So, number 2 is to vacuum your pond. Now I'm using my trusty Awaza Pondovac 5 here, which is very efficient at picking up silt, leaves and other matter that's sitting on the bottom of the pond. But if you haven't got a vacuum, as I say, just the use of a net can be really useful, just to scoop up some of the crud and the muck that has accumulated. Now if you're using a pond vacuum, or Pondovac 5 specifically, there's a collection bag inside the vacuum, and when I finish cleaning I'm going to go through that and make sure that any wildlife, bugs and newts and bits and pieces that I may have inadvertently picked up are returned back to the pond. If you're using a net to scoop out debris from the bottom of the pond, it's worth piling up and depositing discreetly whatever you've removed from the pond close to the water's edge, so that any little bugs and critters from the pond are able to return back to the pond by themselves. Leave it there for a few days, and then once it's dried up a little bit, you can pick it up, stick it in the compost heap. Job number 3. Cut back last season's foliage in the pond. Normally in the winter months, I would cut back any of the emerging marginal foliage, as once we get a frost or two, this starts to die back and decay. We want to reduce as much as possible in ponds, particularly fish ponds, organic matter decomposing or breaking down, because this is going to create more sediment and silt on the bottom of the pond, and it's going to introduce nutrients into the pond that might encourage algae to grow. If you've got a wildlife pond or you're wildlife conscious, it's worth leaving a little bit of the plant matter left alone over the winter months, because there's always some amphibians or some creatures somewhere that might use this as some cover to overwinter. And this is a patch of plants that I'd left during the winter months that I'm going to cut back now. I want to make sure that all of this is gone so that the new growth can grow through unhindered. Doesn't look very nice. Be careful when you're cutting plants in the pond. It's very easy to inadvertently snip through a power cable if you've got pumps or other pond devices in the pond. So be very wary. There are certain plants that look quite nice left alone during the winter months. Some of the grasses and the emerging reeds like reed mace, typically called the bulrush. Those burrs on the end of their tall sort of architectural stem can look rather attractive emerging from the pond during a frosty winter. So quite often I would leave things like that in the pond because they look quite nice. But now is the time to cut those back. Now look, it's worth noting, if you're doing any sort of work in a pond at this time of year, so this is late February, March, early April, you need to keep an eye out for wildlife generally, but particularly spawn, amphibian spawn. Frog spawn and toad spawn is something that you're going to notice. You're not really going to see newts as they lay individual eggs sort of fold up in amongst some of the leaves, but you'll certainly come across frog and toad spawn if you've got amphibians in the pond. And actually, as I'm cutting away some of this, I can see masses and masses of toad spawn, long ribbons of the stuff. If it was fresh spawn, I'd be able to lift it up and show you, but this stuff is actually just beginning to hatch and emerge. So particularly when you're dredging a pond using a vacuum or using a net to scoop out material, if you're concerned about removing tadpoles or disturbing spawn, it's probably best just to leave it alone for a month or two until the tadpoles have turned into little froglets or toadlets and disappeared. So job number 4 is another plant-based one, and that's to fertilise your plants. A lot of marginal plants and some deep water plants, particularly water lilies, are really going to appreciate a helping hand at this time of year with a slow release fertiliser. I'm using some tablets. This is Pond Flora tablets by Waterlife, but other products are available. And these slow release tablets can be pushed down to the base of the plant, providing essential nutrients and trace elements to the plant through the season ahead. If you can't remove the plants from the pond, so the water's pretty chilly at the moment and I don't fancy getting right down to the water lilies and lifting the baskets, instead I'm going to use a hollow tube which I can push down into the pot, drop a tablet down and then kind of manipulate it down with the tube so that it's pushed down beneath the soil. But this is a great way of making sure that your pond plants are going to put on a good display for the season ahead. So my 5th and final recommendation for things to do to your pond this spring is the use of a couple of important treatments in your pond. Now, I always use caution when recommending treatments for ponds. If you walk into any water gardens, there's always a menagerie of magic potions lining the shelf that everybody says are the next best thing or an essential thing that you must add to the pond. And I think less is more. You don't really want to be adding too much rubbish to a pond if you can help it. But there are a couple of things that are definitely useful. And at this time of year, alongside the green water issue, so replacing the UV tube is going to help to alleviate that problem, is the growth of blanket weed or multicellular algae. And this is going to be exacerbated if you've got an efficient filtration system with a working UV and clear water. It'll allow the sunlight to penetrate that water column and actually potentially make blanket weed growth even worse. So at this time of year, before you've even got blanket weed growing, it's worth hitting it with a good quality treatment as a preventative to stop it from growing in the first place. My favourite treatment is cloverleaf blanket answer. I've been using this stuff for years. For many years it's been the UK's most popular treatment for good reason. I'm sure there are other medications and treatments out there which are equally good, but this is one that I trust and use regularly. And when I'm servicing ponds through spring, summer and autumn, this is a staple treatment that I'll use on every visit. So blanket answer is a natural product. It's a powder which you add ideally to water. So I add it to a bucket, mix it up with a bit of pond water just to help it dissolve, and then evenly distribute it around the pond. Now when the pond is clear like this, assuming you're putting the correct dose in, you'll find that the pond will go very, very milky, very cloudy for a day or two. It's quite unsightly, it's harmless, and it will settle and clear, but it doesn't look very nice initially. So if you've got any plans for your pond, a nice weekend and you've got people coming around, don't treat with this first. Wait until you've finished your get-together or gathering. And the second treatment, which I think is worthwhile adding to a pond in spring, is the use of some sort of biological additive or an enzyme to kickstart the pond and particularly the filtration system with beneficial bacteria. This is an Awaza Duo Boost. Another similar treatment is one by Evolution Aqua called a Pond Bomb. And these sort of things, they're a gel impregnated ball. They look quite funky, these. So this is a gel impregnated ball full of essential vitamins and trace elements that slowly dissolve into the water, providing a great habitat and a stable environment in the pond. And the liquid gel within the pot contains lots and lots of beneficial nitrifying bacteria and enzymes, which again very important at this time of year to help recolonise and re-establish the pond, particularly the filtration system, if you've been doing work to it. They look very cool. So that gets chucked in. So one of these treats 20,000 litres of water. It goes a long way. So I'm going to add the rest of the blanket answer to this pond. There's a very, very large volume of water in this pond. In fact, some of you seasoned viewers may recognise this pond from a video I did a couple of years ago now, which was a full drain and clean on this. So if you're interested in seeing that, I'll put the link in the description below. Sun's come out, lovely. Why couldn't it have been like this earlier on? I have to say, my fingers are absolutely freezing. I literally cannot feel them. But that's it for now. That's my 5 recommendations. If you've got any ideas of things or suggestions that you would recommend doing to a pond in spring, stick them in the comments below. I'll be interested to hear them. But I'm Ed from Crystal Clear Aquatics. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next pond. Oh yeah, that sounds crap. Caught on camera. They all have their uses at certain times, but you certainly don't want to be adding treatments to a pond sort of willy-nilly. It's not going to do it any good. But there are a couple of things that I would use regularly. I can't get over willy-nilly, I've got to start again.